It's a wild morning here in Connecticut morning, and we've got a lot of different things happening. And one of the things that you like to do in the summer, if you have a moment, is go out and sit under a tree. Make sure you bring your bug spray, especially if you live where I do. And just pick up a good book and read. Now, I'm not talking like reading on a computer. Maybe you like a Nook or a Kindle or something like that. Me, myself, and I am of a generation where I like a good old paper book. I like to doodle in the margins and things like that. Reading is a large part of summer, and about maybe a month ago, I became familiar with this extraordinary lady, Judy Van Sickle Johnson. And she has a book out called Watching the Game, Reflections from a Woman's Heart, a woman's perspective in the game of baseball. And I had the pleasure with Bob Lazari of interviewing Judy last Monday night, and there were so many discussions that we got on about how baseball is really a literary game. It lends itself to the literary. Going back to Casey at the bat, Mighty Casey has struck out. Football has no such parallel. You know, hockey has no such parallel, but baseball does. And Judy, at least to me, and I'm sure to you if you do get this book, will show you how baseball really can weave its way through the fabric of so many things in your life, from the point where you're a child to a young adult, to a younger adult perhaps, to a young married person, and then when you're building your own homes and having children of your own. It's just something that's always there. It is the regularity of spring. And Judy, I'm so pleased you could be with us today, and thanks so much. How are you, my dear?
Thank you very much for having me, Tony. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
And what amazed me in reading your book, and you know, the first question or the first point I had was the fact of baseball and literature going hand in hand. Judy is a professor of literature, and the amazing thing about this book is if you are a person who may not necessarily be a baseball fan, but you have a passing interest, and you have an interest in literature, you will find this book to be something which will really, really touch your heart. You start out in the book talking about when you're a very young girl in New Jersey and you're following the baseball players on the back of baseball cards, watching a little grainy black and white television, and then unbelievable, you get to go to the park and see everything in living color, and it all becomes so real to you. And how did baseball grip you at such an early age? I just find that fascinating.
Well, part of my story taps into that literary part of me, that literary part that you referenced just a couple of minutes ago. And baseball for me, it really manifested itself in a couple of ways. The tactile game that I was privileged to play, not in a formal way, not in on a boys' little league team, or not even on a girls' team, not in even girls' softball, but on the playground with spontaneous free play with the boys and girls in my classroom. I remember most vividly my 6th grade year, actually, which was very pre-adolescence, but that period in my history intertwined itself with a beloved connection with my own dad, whose favorite form of relaxation when he came home from a very busy job that often demanded his attention 6-7 days a week, we sat down and watched together the very early New York Mets on TV, on New York, Channel 9, the 1963 team of losers, the very early team. I think the first season's record was 40-120. But the record didn't matter to me, as I try to remind myself with the current Mets and Red Sox of 2014. I loved the game. I formed this deep affection for the game by following a team of losers, a team that was the object of ridicule among most people in the greater New York area. My best friend, simultaneously, while I watched these games with my dad and found with that experience the close human connection. I think, Tony, given your introductory remarks, that's what is at the heart of this game, whether it's the player, the fan, the coach. It's about the human connections that are formed at whatever stage of your life. for my, in many cases, it is those early childhood memories of first watching the game, sharing it, learning it with my dad by my side. It was our way of being together, but simultaneously my intellectual curiosity was satisfied because I was learning a whole new vocabulary of, a 6.3 double play and being in the cellar and those metaphors that are part of the rich language.
I use a lot of them, yeah.
That was part of its appeal, together with the configurations on the screen, the personal stories of someone like Gil Hodges, who was one of my dad's heroes.
Mm-hmm.
His heart had been broken when the Dodgers left Brooklyn. But all of those human stories, then combined with my own hobby of collecting the cards, my best childhood friend who lived next door, who was a fan of the Yankees, the games on the playground at school, very spontaneous, unorganized, free play where children felt safe to linger after school unsupervised by adults. And then that kind of intellectual, spiritual, emotional connection with my dad. And all of those things converged at a very important time in my life. Only later to abandon all of that and forsake all of that literature. So it was interesting how I abandoned literature and in my story I come back in adulthood, really kind of in a very gratified way, combining baseball and language and strategy with my love of literature. So that's pretty much what in a nutshell. But those were the beginnings. My dad, my best friend, spontaneously my friends, and those baseball cards and the games that all just coincided with really dynamic, very
And it's an amazing thing because we had talked about this last Monday night, and I'm a great fan to this day of George Plimpton and all of the experiences he did. Tried out for the Lions as a quarterback and tried out for the Baltimore Colts and pitched to the baseball all-stars, and he brought this very acute wit to sports, which to this day just fascinates me. But talking about out of their league, or out of my league, when he was about to pitch in the All-Star game at Yankee Stadium, and the point of the whole discussion that we had was baseball. Two people can watch a baseball game, and it'll mean something entirely different to each of them. Two people can watch a football game, and they'll pretty much see the same thing. Like George Plimpton was talking about a time when the last ball game he played in, they were playing in France by candlelight, and the Countess was playing center field in her gown and her heels, and they were using a beach ball as the night fell. And I'm saying to myself, how does anybody get this out of a baseball game? But yet somehow baseball touches the viewer, the fan, in so many different ways, and that's what makes it fascinating, at least to me, even to this day.
I think that is the beauty of it. Now, I don't understand the game of football very well, but I know, to me, it's a confusing game because, as I've been taught in recent years, unlike baseball, one doesn't necessarily watch the ball. One watches all the things that are going on in the periphery of the ball. That tends to be more important. But I won't embarrass myself by giving you football analogies here. But I do make the point in my narrative, maybe midway through my narrative, that part of the beauty of the game of baseball is it can meet you anywhere in your life and mean something different. It appeals to people on various levels to a very diverse audience, and you can meet it on any level and it can still be good. I mean, if you just want to go to the ballpark and have a beer and eat popcorn, it's entertaining. If you want to think about it in a more deeper, mystical way, it's entertaining. If you're a stat head or a sabermetrician, it has unbelievable numerical rewards. If you're there to teach the game to your kids, or if you're on a first date, I mean, it can meet you at any level and still be good. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't disappointments and losses and moments of boredom, but, I'll tell you a funny anecdote that my brother-in-law, who is a Seattle Mariners fan, was at Safeco Field sitting a few rows behind home plate. And again, the first three innings were apparently fabulous in terms of the small ball events. There was no score. There were maybe a couple of infield hits, a couple of maybe bobble balls, but really fascinating, a well-pitched game. It was a real duel, a pitching duel. And he was seated with a gentleman friend of his, and two women came in to sit behind them in unoccupied seats about maybe in the middle of the fourth inning. And they got there and they turned to my brother-in-law and they said, "What's the score?" And they said, "Nothing, nothing." And one woman turned to the other and said, "Oh, good, then we haven't missed anything." And
oh, you missed the whole thing.
so,
You've missed the whole thing.
so that's kind of one of those things. You know, women can enter the, whether women or men, but people can enter the ballpark, as they often do, I'm told, in Southern California. You know, they can enter middle of the fourth inning and feel, there are those who feel, hey, this is great, I love it, I love the music, I love the games in between innings, and we haven't missed anything. Whereas my brother-in-law was like, oh my gosh, you've missed such important stuff, even though the game is 0-0. But to both of those audiences, having very different expectations and very different levels of understanding, it's what I'm saying is an example of my theme, that baseball can meet you on any level and still be good.
It's really something. And when you talk about ballpark memories now, I am of that. We're contemporary in age, and I am of that. Shall we say, early Met era, because there wasn't a National League team you could watch in New York between 1958 and 1962, and the Mets came, and a lot of us jumped on the Met bandwagon because we were seeing these people come into the park like Roberto Clemente and Willie Mays and you know, Gordon Coleman and a young Willie Stargell, that, you know, Henry Aaron, that we had only heard about, and this is really exciting to us. But I begged my father to take me to the Polo Grounds, and one day he did. And it was my father, my brother, I believe my mother and I, we were sitting in the Polo Grounds, and I have great memories of that to this day, and the Rheingold scoreboard and the flags flying out, and you could see the old Yankee Stadium, and it looks so, I don't know what the word is, it looks so imposing and foreboding, like, you know, we're the Yankees, we're General Motors, we win every year, and, you know, you're over there in this rickety old dump of a ballpark with this upstart team. Shame on you. And I just remember all of this just so pointedly. But the thing that really got me about this game, and I think it's just, you know, again, people's perceptions of baseball, we were sitting in the park watching the game. I believe it was the Mets versus the Cincinnati Reds, and two people showed up behind us. They were in military uniforms. There was an older man in an army uniform, in an officer's uniform. It was, you know, maybe not that far after World War II. He had a bunch of battle ribbons, and he had those MacArthur-ish sunglasses and the cap, and everything was perfectly in place. And next to him, or seated right next to him, was an enlisted sailor in his full sailor's, uniform. And it wasn't his dress blues, it was just his blues that he would wear like if he were going on leave. And I thought to myself, even at the age that I was, this is unusual, that, you know, you don't see, officers and enlisted men fraternizing, nor do you see them fraternizing across service lines. And I looked, and then I looked over my shoulder, and I looked again, and Judy, for the life of me, the officer's arm, I know you can't see me, the officer's arm was on the armrest of the chair. The sailor's arm was right next to him, and they were bound by handcuffs. And I'm saying to my father, Dad, the sailor's in handcuffs in the Polo Grounds on a Sunday, 1962, the Mets are playing. And the minute that the officer heard handcuffs, he very graciously handed me the toy of his Cracker Jack box and got the sailor and went way down the other side. And I thought, wow, this is like my first memory of a baseball game. It's amazing. I can only tell you it happened, and it's just, and then I think of Joe Garagiola, whom I love to this day, because watching him on the Game of the Week and the anecdotes and the stories, but he wrote that book, which I still have, I think, on the back bookshelf. I'll never get rid of it. Baseball is a funny game. And there is so much humor in baseball. You think of it as a very serious game, but there's a lot of funny things that happen. And it's just, I'm sure you have several anecdotes.
Well, I do, and it's interesting. Your military illustration, that charming, humorous story really touches a chord, because just 24 hours ago, my daughter and I were sitting in a national cemetery at a Memorial Day service, and it's one example, yet again, of how baseball intersects, often very serendipitously, but quite purposefully, I think, with other events in life. And there I was sitting among, all the representatives of the armed forces, and I'm down in Beaufort, South Carolina right now at the National Cemetery, and directly past us walks a man wearing a Jackie Robinson jersey. And together with some of his military paraphernalia, and I thought, oh my gosh, there we go again. Jackie Robinson, of course, himself, an American veteran. And
right.
That's the piece. Well, that's not a funny moment. I mean, that to me was a somber occasion. But I thought, here again, it is in my life, the presence of baseball asserting itself. As far as the humorous stories, I mean, my first experience with baseball live, after watching it on that tiny, grainy, black and white TV, was that first spectacle of Shea Stadium, which I think, as I mentioned in my book, some fans and connoisseurs of the game consider it one of the ugliest baseball stadiums ever built. Of course, it exists no longer. But it's yet another paradox in my background and my love of the game, that not only did I fall for a miserably failing a team that was failing miserably, my first experience with a ballpark, it was not Wrigley Field, it was not Fenway, it was not Yankee Stadium, the Cathedral, it was ugly Shea Stadium. I believe my first trip was 1965, but I fell in love with that landscape because, as many others, this experience is not personal to me, not peculiar to me. It's part of the universal sensation of walking into that ballpark for the first time and feeling the landscape itself hit you with its full force. It's the geometry, it's that vivid green, it's that wonderful enclosure of space, whether it was, the polo grounds. My dad used to hitchhike to the polo grounds, actually. Whatever form it takes, there's something bucolic about that green space. And for me, holding my dad's hand and seeing all those players doing their workouts on the field, it was as if those cardboard cards had suddenly come to life. That grainy black and white image had sprung into, full Technicolor, Disney Technicolor, and it was alive. And it was this incarnation of kind of my dreams, my fantasies, and what had up until that point just been entertainment on a box. And the scoreboard on that morning, or that early afternoon, was blank. Shea Stadium's old scoreboard was a big black rectangle.
Yes.
And this was back in the day when we didn't have, commands and imperatives on the scoreboard telling us to cheer and telling us to cheer louder, and, trumpet fanfares and games and a lot of noise in between innings. I loved the quiet of it. And so we watched a lot of pregame, we watched BP, and I had already chosen my favorite player, and my favorite player was Ed Kranepool, who would remain with the New York Mets for his entire career. He was a young 21-year-old man at the time, and I basically fell in love with him as a player because we shared the same birthday. I mean, it was just not a big deal. It had nothing to do really with his stats, but there was this common ground that I shared with the baseball that put a name on this large game and enabled me to identify with it in a more personal way. So I just adopted him as my personal favorite. And on that day, he came up to the plate in the bottom of the second, and this is one of the early chapters of my memoir. He comes up to the plate, batting behind Roy McMillan, who had just, I think, had a leadoff single. Ed Kranepool came up. I don't remember what the count was. I think maybe a 2-1 count. My dad and I were sitting in one of the upper tiers of Shea Stadium in that blue section, the mezzanine. I think the only ones in our section. The attendance that day was something like 13,000. Ed Kranepool smacked a home run into right center field, and that sealed the deal. That was it. I felt it was meant to be. I accepted that home run as a personal gift just to me, even though, as I say in the narrative, he never so much looked in our direction when he crossed home plate. But that moment of scoring a run against the Cincinnati Reds, there was, all the famous Cincinnati Reds of the 60s. Pete Rose was there, I believe. Johnny Bench had been there, I don't recall, in the mid-60s. I mean, it was a formidable Cincinnati lineup, and the Mets won 5-2 that day, or 5-3. And that sealed the deal. That was my first game, my first visit to a real stadium, and it bonded me even more closely to my dad. We have, 8mm home movies with no sound from that day, so a lot of things, again, converged on that day. And I later read Ron Swoboda, who I know you have interviewed. I listened to his whole interview with you a few nights ago after I appeared on your show with Bob. And there's some of the humor in the game. If you want to laugh about baseball, tune into Ron Swoboda.
Oh, for sure.
In reflecting back on the 65, 66 Mets, 67 Mets just before the 69 World Series and the Miracle Mets, he said those early fans, sure as bleep, weren't watching anything that you could call baseball, but they came. And he reflects back upon how there was something very special in the ballpark, even though, you know, the fans like me, sure as blank, weren't watching anything that resembled baseball. So I find his memories to be really, really humorous.
Well, you know, and you mentioned Shea Stadium, and it's the thing which really became, as time went on, sort of a tired ashtray, but in the early days, I mean, the World's Fair was there, and it was like new and bright, and there were colors on the scoreboard, and you'd walk in the park, and the message, as you said, there was no cheer and say charge and do the wave or whatever. Just in, you know, plain letters, you were listening to Jane Jarvis, the Queen of Melody, playing on the Thomas organ. And that's my memories of the Met games. And then, which I said to Ron, and which I say to any, you know, early Met, I had Rod Gasper on last year, we talked about it. These guys were really the babysitters for a generation of New York kids, because before the game, they'd all come over to the third base line, they'd all be signing, posing for pictures, you know, and Tug McGraw really probably more so than anybody. Try doing that today. I mean, it really was a large part of our growing up.
Absolutely, Tony, and I feel so privileged. While, you know, the team continues to be maybe a subject of ridicule, and in a town where the Yankees are a looming presence, I feel so privileged as a young girl to have witnessed the early years of a Tom Seaver who dignified the game, who brought dignity to what, that's a lovely metaphor, you know, what the ballpark that would later become, you know, an ashtray. But in its early years, he contributed that feeling of, I mean, as close to perfection as you would get on that beautiful landscape. And, you know, I saw Tug McGraw in his early days. I feel so privileged to have witnessed the Seaver-Kuzman era. Tug McGraw coming on in relief, Nolan Ryan's very early years. You know, I still look at him sitting in the stands in Texas, you know, in Texas or now in Houston, and just marvel at the fact that, hey, I watched a really important piece of baseball history as a young girl, and I really feel proud that I loved it before everybody jumped on the bandwagon in '69. For me, it was a legitimate affection before they had really proved themselves as a championship team.
Well, what's amazing to me, and very few people remember, there's a Polo Grounds page on Facebook, and there's a few of us diehards that remember the Polo Grounds. I don't go back to Giants and Dodgers, but I do go back to Mets. When Ralph Kiner was doing Kiner's Corner in the early days, they'd have the star of the game on, who almost invariably was somebody on another team. Do you remember what the prize was for a ball player's appearance on Kiner's Corner in the early days?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. You broke up in the middle.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you remember what the prize was on Kiner's Corner for a player appearing in the early days? What the player received?
No, I do not, and it's funny because I watched that show religiously almost every night that the games were on TV, and the whole family had gone to bed, and I would watch, but I do not remember that detail.
This will give you a chuckle. A toy rambler. Imagine handing Willie Mays a toy rambler. Thanks, Wooly. Thanks for being on the show. Here's a toy rambler for you. Judy, this is unbelievable. We're out of time. Tell us about your book and where our viewers and listeners and soon-to-be readers can pick it up.
Yes, the book is available in both paperback and hardcover. The paperback is probably the best value. It is available in an ebook format. However, I would discourage readers from purchasing that, no matter how much you may like your Kindle or your reader, because it doesn't format the box scores. I have a lot of box scores, game summaries, intertwined with poetry, interestingly enough.
And scripture,
but
yes.
It's not heavy-handed in either of those regards, but the formatting does not work very well in the electronic format. So Amazon.com, it's up there. Judy Johnson, Watching the Game. Ralph Kiner is featured at the turning point in the memoir because I was actually living out in California when this book first came into being as a story, although I wasn't writing it at the time. A pivotal chapter takes place in 1986, and I was living in Palo Alto, scanning manually the channels on our little kitchen Zenith television, just looking for something to watch while I was cooking dinner. And as I scanned through the channels, up came a familiar voice and a familiar face, and it was Ralph Kiner. And I had given up baseball for the previous 8 to 10 years of my life, and that was
Wow.
that voice of Ralph Kiner and his face. And then Lindsey Nelson joined at the microphone, and I felt as if I had died in content heaven. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm in California, 3,000 miles from home, and the Mets are in my kitchen. They are literally in the kitchen. And that chapter is the pivotal turning point that brought me back to the game, back to the Mets, and then the chapters build toward the 1986 World Series, where I was rooting against the Mets while my boss, in the meantime, wore a Boston Red Sox cap on his head. So the dynamics of that chapter are pretty interesting.
It sure is.
So I don't know if you wanted me to summarize any more of the story, or I don't know where we are on time, Tony. But,
We're just about out, sadly. So what we will do is we will post your interview, and we'll be conversing in the future. And we thank you so much for being with us. I really do appreciate it on such short notice. And continuing best as always, Judy.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, and best to you. It's my pleasure. It's a true privilege, and let's go Mets, and take good care. Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you. Judy Van Sickle Johnson, just a delightful lady, and really touches your heart with watching the game. We will be soon joined by the legendary Donna Warren, and coming up on our last hour, make sure you stay with us. And then after Donna, Howard Peretz in the Sports Finish Index. Tony DeAngelo in Connecticut Morning. Right back after this.